Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Michael Itzkowitz, president of the HEA Group, a higher ed consulting and research group that focuses on helping colleges be more affordable. Michael has held multiple positions at the Department of Education, dealing with policy for K-12 and higher education that included accreditation, minority serving institutions, financial aid award letters, and data transparency. Most notably, he was the director of the administration's College Scorecard, an initiative that focused on higher education transparency and accountability. The scorecard, announced by President Obama in February 2013, is the largest release of higher education data ever by the federal government. Michael's tenure at the department included having served as Deputy Chief of Staff in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and he joins us today to talk about the importance of data and ROI for college presidents. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Drumm.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to our conversation. You have had quite a career in higher ed, not only with your own consulting group, the HEA Group, which I've got to ask you how you came up with that name. I'm thinking higher education something, but I don't know for sure.
I think you're onto something.
and then, with the department as well. For our listeners, give us a little background on how you got to this place and, your love of data, because you're an expert in that.
How do you come to love data? That is a wonderful question. Well, I grew up in South Florida in Broward County. That's just a little bit north of Miami. Lived in the same house my entire life until I went to college. Grew up in a pretty mixed up neighborhood with different types of friends from different types of places, and went to a very low performing high school. When I got to college, I pretty much took summer classes because I wasn't good enough to get into the fall semester. And I took some of the hardest, quote unquote, classes known as the Age of Dinosaurs and anthropology, and ended up getting a C and a B minus in both of those classes. That's when I knew that I hadn't really learned how to learn, and I was far behind a lot of my college classmates. And it's really the first time I felt like I had to learn how to learn and put in significant effort to be able to succeed. So I finally figured out how to do that, narrowed down my major after choosing a couple, going between psychology, because my brother studied it, eventually going to business, and then sociology, and started a PhD sociology program at the University of Florida. And I had this weird opportunity where a former senator and governor named Senator Bob Graham opened up a policy center, and he was very interested in civic education and civic engagement. So I ended up changing my thesis from race and ethnicity in education to how do we encourage more students to become civically engaged and civically knowledgeable through things that we can do in the K through 12 classroom. And right as I was studying this, I happened to read a book by some guy who was running for president with a funny name, and his last name was Obama. And I became very encouraged to get involved. So I left my PhD program, joined the campaign, eventually ended up in the Department of Education, working as a confidential assistant, which is like a fancy word for the term scheduler for someone very important. Worked my way up, eventually was there for so long, 6 years, that everyone else left. And by default, I had the most institutional knowledge, came to run this program called the College Scorecard, which is all the higher education data in the United States, and then slowly started analyzing it when I left in 2016, and I've been doing it ever since.
College Scorecard, that rings tremor in so many people's lexicon and minds as far as what it does. I like it. I think it's a fabulous tool. But tell us about how you came to this.
I'm tremoring from excitement. So I don't know who you're talking to, but we must be talking to some different folks. But no, I totally understand what you're saying. The College Scorecard itself was announced in the 2013 State of the Union by President Obama, and it was presented as a school that students and families can use to ensure that they're getting the best bang for their educational buck. And as crazy as it seems, we had all this information on college outcomes and college inputs, where students come from, but it really wasn't in an easy to understand centralized place. So that was the thought behind it. And when we formally launched it again in 2015, we started to incorporate more data and more data and more data. And the most exciting piece of data was earnings data, actual employment data for students. And they've continued to build on that ever since. And right now, there's about 6,000 institutions of higher education included in the scorecard data set. There's about 2,000 variables for each individual institution itself. So there's a consumer site where anyone can go on and find out outcomes. If you're interested in University of Georgia or Georgia State, you're thinking about where to go. Or if you're a researcher, there's all this information on the back end and you can really dig in and get dirty. In terms of tremors that it's bringing people, it might be because we have more data and on college outcomes than ever before. And we're forced to look at those more than we ever have.
Well, I love data-driven decision-making. I think it's so important. You can't only use data, you've got to use good judgment with it as well. But it takes a lot of the guesswork out on who's doing what and how well.
Absolutely. One of the key things that we were trying to answer through the creation of something like the College Scorecard is, if you're a student or a family and you're looking at a college, are you likely to graduate, get a decent paying job, be able to pay down your loans, and get on with your life? And it essentially answered those questions. And then you could dig so much deeper. If you're this type of student, or you go to this type of institution, a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution, what kind of college majors are offered there? And what kind of outcomes or earnings are the former students getting after majoring in a specific field of study? So, from a student perspective, it provides that. And we've seen a lot of college presidents now coming to accept that the scorecard exists and think about creative ways that they can use it.
Well, and I think that's important. But when you first introduced it, people wanted to run for the hills.
Yeah, I mean, we did receive, some hesitation in terms of what folks were thinking when we said that we're going to start to make all of this data available. I think that you and I were talking the other day, and essentially the field and college presidents, they sort of went through the 5 stages of grief, beginning with denial, thinking about, where does this data even come from? It's not even real. Why are they putting it out there? And then anger. Why are they putting this out? This must be flawed. There must be something wrong with the data. Then moving on to bargaining, okay, well, if you're going to use this graduation rate, why don't we use this one instead? Maybe it'll make us look a little bit better. It's more reflective of our student body. And then slowly moving into depression and saying, and then eventually, I think where we're at now is acceptance, where folks are seeing it. They're understanding the data's out there. It's not going anywhere. And we're just continuing to build upon it. So beyond acceptance, there's an understanding that finally, I think everyone knows that this data exists that works in the college world, especially college presidents and college administrators. But now we're starting to see folks think about, okay, am I going to be one of the leaders that uses this data to address opportunity and work on continuous improvement? Or am I still going to kind of wait a couple years and potentially fall behind by still intentionally not recognizing that it's there in the first place?
Well, I now understand how you were able to get to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 5 stages of death and dying, having been the psychology major for a while at Florida. So thank you for, filling in that blank for me. You left the department. You've continued your love affair with data, the HEA Group.
That's right. The HEA Group, to answer your earlier question, it's a play off of the main higher education law, which is known as the Higher Education Act.
Of course.
So it officially stands for the Higher Education Advisory Group. I've had this name for a while, but essentially formally launched just a few months ago in March. And one of the things that we've been doing, besides working with interesting folks, interesting clients across the board to do good work on behalf of low and moderate income students, is I've sort of created a data warehouse to where I'm looking through all this data. I find something interesting. As I mentioned, there's 2,000 variables in this data set. Some would say it's unwieldy. Some would say it's unmanageable. Some would say this is super exciting. I can't wait to dig through the other 1,999 of them. I might be be the weirdo that falls into that last cohort. And I take all this data, understanding that most people are not like me, and I clean up the data. I make it very well, presentable, and I write reports on it. And I've done things looking at net cost, how much students pay out of pocket if you're a lower or a high income student. I've looked at college majors across the board, over 36,000 college majors, and said how much are students earning? Are they making below $25,000? In between 20 and 30,000, between 30 and 40,000, above 40,000. I've looked at the average of college majors. If you're a psychology major or a sociology major or an engineer or a welder, how much are you making depending on the type of institution that you attend? And I've written these reports. And I think one of the most exciting things is I put all my data out into the public and I make it readily available for anyone in a very easily understandable format. So here's my small plug. If you want to go on the HEAgroup.com, it's available to you. So you can use it. And I'm hoping that folks use it beyond myself, because I see that being more transformative rather than me keeping it in my hard drive and letting it rest and collect dust overnight.
I so much appreciate what you're doing for many universities with that. You've taken the College Scorecard and put it on steroids with some of the things you're doing. We talked a little bit about ROI for a college degree. That's a big thing in the news right now. So tell us, if you would, a little bit about why is ROI important, for those people who aren't data wonks, how you measure it, and how people can use it to make better decisions.
I think one of the reasons why it's most important is the I part, the investment part that folks are making nowadays. College used to be pretty affordable. We hear these anecdotal stories. I used to live in Washington, D.C. for a while. So I'd hear former senators or current senators saying, college used to cost $50 a college credit. And I said, well, thanks, Elizabeth Warren. It definitely does not cost that much anymore. It's a lot more expensive. So, it's about $15,000 a year on average for a 4-year degree. That's per year. If you do the math, if you were to finish in 4 years, that's $60,000 on average. Some are way more expensive than that. So we've seen prices go up exponentially, which has really caused folks to think, okay, what am I getting for this investment? I think the pandemic also piled onto that, in the last few years, where we saw folks that were separated from actual in-classroom, on-campus classes. And they were forced essentially to learn from their own house or anecdotally their parents' basement. Right? They're taking college classes, but they're paying the same tuition from a basement. And they're wondering, what am I getting? Am I getting the bang for my buck, for my educational buck? So we've seen those things sort of pop up. And I've been doing this work since I left the department. I was running a project, running all this data and the project when I was in the department. But when I got out of the department, I said, I want to start looking at it and I want to start analyzing it. And I started seeing some things that weren't as promising as I had hoped. I mean, on the promising side of things, what I saw is college is still worth it. If you go to college, you're going to have more life chances than someone who doesn't, on average across the board. But when you disaggregate the data and you start to look at the different types of institutions, you can see that some pay off really quickly, but then there are others that lead to no economic return whatsoever.
That's not good. That's not good at all.
No, it's not good. And I started to ask the question, are these schools that I would want to send my own children to? And unfortunately, too often of the time, the answer was no. I'll just give you an example. I started to think about different ways that I could measure return on investment. And I believe it was 2019, I created something called the price to earnings premium. And it's essentially taking these two variables. One is cost. How much am I paying to earn a specific degree? And the other one is earnings. How much am I earnings? What's my premium? And the way that I define that is, am I earning more than someone who graduated high school but has no college experience? It's essentially the counterfactual. If you didn't go to college at all, how much am I earning? And is going to college worth it? And how this kind of worked is it measures the time that it takes students to recoup their educational costs. So let's just say hypothetically, I decide I want to go to the University of Georgia. And I saw that it costs $15,000 a year out of pocket. I made the assumption that it would take students 4 years on average to graduate from the University of Georgia. We know it takes a little bit longer through National Student Clearinghouse. It takes about 5.1 years on average to graduate from a 4-year institution. But I gave colleges the benefit of the doubt. And I said, it's going to take 4 years. So if it costs $15,000 a year, It's going to cost approximately $15,000, $30,000, $45,000, $60,000 after 4 years out of pocket. Now, that's a pretty hefty sum, but how long does it take students to recoup those costs? So if I was a student in Georgia and I went there, but I was making $10,000 more a year than someone who never went to college, that's my earnings premium. I'm now making $10,000 a year more. So I'm able to use that $10,000 to recoup those $60,000 in costs after about 6 years of attending the institution. So I did that for about 4,000 institutions across the United States. And we saw some really promising numbers to where almost 2/3 of institutions allow their students to recoup their costs within 10 years or less. As I mentioned, overall, college is still very, very much worth it. And that was really promising. But at the other end of my sample, I saw that there are 442 colleges, about 14% of colleges within the sample I was looking at, to where they actually left the majority of students earning even less than the typical high school graduate. And that number just really shook me. And, number one, for transparency purposes, we need to make this information available to students and families. But it also made me think about what's the federal policy role in this? How can we better safeguard students and protect their well-beings, as well as taxpayers who help finance their educational endeavors every single year?
That number, 14%, is shocking. It really is. Did you see any particular trends on the types of colleges that graduates were not getting a good return?
I did, and what I'll say is that there's good colleges across the board from every sector, and there are some not so good colleges in every sector. But there were some disproportionate numbers that stood out. So, public institutions, they are really seen as the most affordable and provide a very quick return on investment. And on the other end of the spectrum, what I saw is that it was oftentimes shorter term programs, shorter term institutions like certificate granting institutions, that if they worked well, they provide one of the quickest paths to socioeconomic mobility. You're only in a school for a year, maybe 18 months, you get your certificate, you gain your skills, you enter the workforce, and you start earning money immediately. So there's not a lot of opportunity costs that you're missing out on. But what I also saw is about half of those programs left the majority of students earning even less than the typical high school graduate. And it happened to be located specifically within the for-profit sector where they were heavily concentrated. So there were a lot of for-profit certificate programs, oftentimes short-term, oftentimes smaller schools, that really left the majority of students earning so little, even after they've spent so much time and money.
Mm-hmm. Is this a good basis for gainful employment?
It definitely gives some weight to the fact that if the department is limited in its ability to focus on a specific type of institution, right now it's limited within statute, where it's only allowed to focus on all for-profit programs, but also certificate granting programs at public and private nonprofit institutions. So if you were to think about the most risky programs, it is all of those programs that fall into this bucket. So until there's some congressional action to where we can think about more comprehensive accountability for all higher education institutions and all college programs, I think it's a really good start.
I can't say that I am surprised, but I am surprised that it was weighted so heavily in the for-profit sector. I mean, I've a number of friends who work in that sector. There's a number of good schools out there that are doing, but I've got to think that there are some good private schools, not-for-profit private, that are running into the same issue as well because of the cost of the tuition.
There are, and a lot of times we'll see that those students are earning more, but they're also paying more. So, they take longer to pay off, is essentially what I saw. And I also looked at college programs across the United States. So, I wasn't just limiting this to institutions, but I thought, to your point, there are certain institutions to where they may be doing really well or maybe really poorly, but it might just be a bad apple here and there, a certain program that's weighing the whole institution down. So I'm able to look at graduates across all institutions. These are students that have done everything right. They paid their tuition, they've gotten their certificate or degree, and they've entered the workforce. And we're able to measure their earnings 2 years after they've graduated. Now we're actually able to do it 4 years, but in my study, it was limited to 2 years. And what I saw is that at certificate granting institutions, 42% of them showed no economic ROI whatsoever, meaning that even 2 years after graduating, the majority of students were earning less than the typical high school graduate. So there are things, we do know numbers, we can make action-driven decisions, And it doesn't mean that we need to immediately stop offering an education in a sector. To your point, you mentioned the for-profit institutions, and there are 30% of them to where students are recouping their educational costs within 5 years or less. So, this really it's concentrated in certain areas, but we do notice some good apples and some bad apples across the board.
I'm curious. If there were 3 programs you would say students definitely need, if they've got an aptitude for them, of course, students should go to for the highest ROI, what would they be?
Specific types of programs, I would say everyone should become a nurse.
Okay.
Send your child to nursing school.
Get over your blood phobias.
Get over the blood phobia immediately. And it's really interesting. If you get a certificate, an associate's, or a bachelor's in nursing, they're consistently some of the best ROI programs. What we've heard too is that there is a huge demand for nurses across the United States right now as well. So I think that's going to be a really strong profession moving forward. Unsurprisingly, are all the STEM fields, so computer science is something that we've seen skyrocket, not only in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of employment. And I think, to your other question, or to raise another question, is this coming at the detriment of other types of programs like liberal arts programs? And the question is, I'm not sure. What I do see when I put out studies like this, Drumm, some folks will say, they're like, Michael, why do you hate the liberal arts? And why do you hate theater programs so much? What's your beef? Or are you not a cultured person who appreciates drama and theater and the liberal arts? And I'm a sociology major. I have to remind them of that. And some of this is a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, if you went to a 4-year school and you major in the liberal arts, you're still going to have an ROI. It might take a little bit longer than if you're a STEM major. But we do notice, 4-year liberal arts degrees, they do show an ROI. And what we know about liberal arts degrees is that after about 5 years, students really seem to get into their stride in terms of earning potential and salary. So our earnings is still short term right now. I mean, that's sort of what we're limited to. So something to keep in mind. But I think it's worth for everyone to take a look at these numbers and to make sure that they'll be able to afford and be comfortable with whatever major that they're deciding on. And to also realize that different majors may have different outcomes at different institutions.
Which makes perfect sense to me. Typically, someone who is solely focused on STEM and they don't have what we used to call the bull courses, I mean, the liberal arts courses, things along those lines. If you don't have a balanced education, how do you learn how to work with people if you're just so focused on a computer screen?
And there's also this other thing of just learning how to interpret stuff. Geez, I'm not going to say I'm good at it at all. But, just like if I just studied data science, I really wouldn't understand what to do with the data. I would know how to run the numbers. I know how to crunch them. I would know how all the formulas and how to manipulate it most effectively, way more, way better than I do right now. But I would literally have no idea what to do with them or how to answer, put together things that were hopefully answering some of the questions that folks have regarding if schools pay off or not, or where are our taxpayer dollars going in higher education, or which college majors pay the most. So to your point, I think that there is benefits, some tangible and some intangible, that come out of college that just aren't measured economically. These are to show if students do get an economic return or not. And I don't believe that they're exclusive of each other. I think that you can get a good economic return and also still have a well-rounded education.
Well, I certainly hope so. It's the kids nowadays that are going through college, getting their jobs, et cetera, are going to take care of me and maybe even you in our old age. So let's hope they can figure out what to do with the data and use it properly.
I remind my 2 children every day that they will be taking care of me when I'm older. So let's hope that they will.
Absolutely. You mentioned something a little bit earlier, economic mobility, and how important that is becoming. Tell us a little more about that.
One of the key things that I also looked at after running these price to earnings premium metrics is I decided to run for lower income students. I was interested in answering the question of, I know that these students pay a different amount and they earn a different amount. So why don't I look at these numbers with data, one of the variables that's available in the College Scorecard, for the most vulnerable students, see how much they pay, how much they earn, and come up with my own price earnings premium for which institutions are serving low-income students the best across the United States. So I put in my formula, I ran this code, pressed enter on my keyboard, and what popped out, in terms of the best ROI for low-income students? It happened to be schools like Duke, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and University of Chicago. And I looked at it and I said, congratulations, Michael, you just created the US News rankings list. You can send out your resume and you will be hired immediately. You can, job well done, time to go home. So I started thinking about this, and I looked at the numbers, and then I saw this other number next to them, and it was the number of Pell Grant students, the number of low and moderate income students that attended each of those schools. And I noticed that they were all below 20%. It really got me thinking in terms of, what is the point of higher education to begin with? Is it really to reward the few and the fortunate, well-resourced institutions across the United States? Or is it to really recognize those that are lifting this generation up and leaving them better off than the previous generation? And if it's the latter, how do we measure that? So I took these two numbers into account. These schools that were on the top, like Harvard and Yale, they still scored within the 99th percentile in ROI. If you're a low-income student, if you're fortunate enough, one of the few dozen to get into these schools, you're going to do very well there. You're going to receive a generous scholarship. You're going to receive an amazing ROI. You're going to do very well, but you probably do well wherever you went. You're probably very well, academically gifted. But then I looked at this number next to it and I decided, well, what if I put these two numbers together, the ROI, so where we're still recognizing those top performing schools, but also the percentage of Pell Grant students. So I meshed them together and created something called the Economic Mobility Index. And what happened when I took these two numbers into account, the ROI for low-income students and the proportion of low and moderate income students? Well, schools like Harvard, who are ranked number 4 in terms of the ROI they provide to low and moderate income students, they dropped to number 847 out of 1,320 schools. And schools like University of Chicago, who are ranked number 8 in terms of ROI for low-income students, if you can get in there, they dropped to number 860 out of 1,320 schools, as they just weren't serving any of these students to begin with. And then there's the next question, well, who rose to the top? It happened to be all Hispanic serving institutions in the top 10, located in New York, California, and Texas. And I brought this information to the head of an association called Excellencia. They give a seal of excellence to focus specifically on Hispanic serving institutions. And I showed them the info and I said, look at this information. It's all HSIs at the top of this list. And they looked at me and they said, well, duh, Michael, we've known that forever. We provide them with a seal of excellence. But now we have the data to back it up. There were also some other interesting findings. So other schools that are normally nowhere to be found on popular news rankings lists like the U.S. News. HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, there were 7 in the top 100 in terms of economic mobility. So these are schools that have been delivering on the promise of higher education for years. They not only enroll a high proportion of low and moderate income students, but they also serve them extremely well.
Mm-hmm. Did you look at community colleges with this information?
Well, that's the next question I'm usually asked. So we haven't yet, but it's on my list of things to do when I'm able to get around to it. But they often serve a higher proportion of low and moderate income students. So it's a growing field that needs to be examined. And I'm interested in hopefully being able to produce that study in the near future.
Mm-hmm. So what are the next steps we need to take? Do we need more transparency, more accountability? What's needed?
I think both. It's great that this information is getting out there, but transparency within and by itself is not going to be an equal substitute for accountability. It's just not. And this is me saying this as the former director of the College Scorecard. There's no one should be saying transparency is the bee's knees more than myself. But, we really need to couple this with strong accountability now that we have this data and we're able to see that there are some programs that just really are not producing economic mobility, but more so at worst, perpetuating socioeconomic inequality. We shouldn't be funding these in terms of federal funding and providing them with taxpayer dollars if they're actually leaving students worse off. There's not a lot of them, but we should be holding schools accountable for the outcomes of their students. So I really do think that's number one. Number two, we do need to get this into the hands of more students and have them have this information up front and make it available to them so that they can make the best decisions and the most informed decisions when choosing a college. That's number two. Number three, it's extremely important for college administrators. As I mentioned, Drumm, we have all of this information on program level data as of right now. So if I'm a community college president and I have 50 college programs, I could see the economic outcomes for all 50 of my programs. I could potentially see that 35 are serving students really well to where they're able to recoup their educational costs within 5 years or less. 10 are on the fringe where it takes a little bit longer, somewhere between 5 and 20 years. And then maybe 5 that just aren't serving students as well as we would like them to. And they're actually leaving the majority, earning less than a typical high school graduate. And I think that this gives information, puts it at the fingertips of college presidents to where they can, at the minimum, dig deeper. It's a flag to dig deeper and start asking questions of, is it the department itself, the professors within the department? Is it the curriculum that we're providing them with? We're just not giving them the skills that are necessary to succeed, within the workforce nowadays. Is it our career resource center to where we're not actively matching graduates up with employers that have open jobs? Are we not doing a good enough job there? Or are we actually offering credentials to where there's no jobs within the geographic region that we're offering them? The answer is usually the latter, but not always. But I've seen a lot of college presidents talk about using it in this way, really creatively and just thinking about continuous improvement efforts. So I think that that's a really important part as we think about ways to improve higher education as a whole.
So, and there's also, the federal aspects to it, state aspects, et cetera, which we've gotten into a little bit. But from a college president perspective, what do you think? You just mentioned a few things, but what are the most critical things that they should be looking at to improve their outcomes?
I think one of the most important things is to look at the employment outcomes, number one, to think about where your students are falling in terms of programs across the board. But also, it's really critical to be forward-looking rather than backward-looking. The earnings data itself, we're looking at graduates 4 years later. So these are students that have left 4 years prior. It's basically a reflection of your programs a little bit behind. There's a 4-year lag time. So it's critically important that we not only look at this data as it's actionable data, but to also think about our program offerings, enrollment trends, and to be able to match those credentials with the open jobs and the growing jobs within your geographic region that will be opening up over the next 5 to 10 years. It's really critical that we think about not preparing the workforce of the past, but preparing the workforce of the future.
Yeah, and like, was it BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics? They should have what are the projected jobs going to be for the next 10 years, et cetera.
Exactly. And there's a lot of more even nuanced data where that states have available. So not only, nationally, but also within the state of Texas or in Florida or in Arkansas. What are the jobs there? Because they're all going to differ given the geographic region. So it's really important that we not just look at that national number, but we really tailor it down to the communities that we're serving students in.
Mm-hmm. Does your data take into account, I know it does economic mobility, but also physical mobility, i.e. moving?
So with national data, you get something kind of cool and you're able to track students nationally. I'm able to see the incomes of students regardless of where they went. I may not know if they left the state of Florida and now live in New York, but I'm able to at least understand how much they're earning after they leave a specific institution of higher education. That's something that's unique about the federal data, which matches students' federal financial aid recipients to their tax returns. Now, I don't have the information on individual students. It's very well privacy protected, but we do see an aggregate number of entire cohorts of students and how much the typical students are making. When you think about state level data, that's one limitation that they do have, is that if I have a state level data system within a specific state, it's a little bit more difficult for me to track my students' employment outcomes if they were to move out of state, as I'm no longer receiving any sort of tax record from them.
Understand. This has been fabulous. I am a frustrated data wonk myself, but I know that's not where I need to be. So in closing, 3 takeaways for presidents and boards.
I would say come to recognize that the data's out there and it's not leaving. This stuff is going to keep coming out. So recognize that it's there. Number 2 is to use it. Doesn't mean that it needs to be the end of every decision making, but it doesn't mean that it can't be incorporated into the start. It's a piece of data and information that helps you make better decisions. Number 3 is to be a leader. If you don't use it, you're going to be left behind. So it's time for more leaders to go out there, to embrace it, and to not be scared of it, because we're all working to better the lives of students. And I met so many folks in higher education that have been successful at doing just that. So it's promising to where we're seeing folks going, and I'm just excited about the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. What's next for you?
We're going to keep trucking here at the HEA Group. We're going to have a lot more analyses coming out, a lot more data coming out in the future. So please keep an eye out. I do have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. I put out a blog every month or so at the HEAgroup.com. So feel free to subscribe. And you can also happily contact me there or download all the fun data that we've been talking about today.
Well, very good. Michael, this has been a real pleasure. I thank you so much for your time coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to Michael Itzkowitz, president of the HEA Group, and for his sharing his thoughts with us on data and ROI. Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure having you on the show. Tune in next week as we welcome Dr. Thomas Parham, president of CSU Dominguez Hills, and Dr. Dilcy Perez, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Academic and Student Affairs for the Cal State System. They will be joining us to talk about alternative strategies to diversifying the student body in the wake of the SCOTUS decision that did away with affirmative action in college recruitment, something that the Cal State System has been successfully dealing with since Prop 209 was passed 20 years ago. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.